Welcome to Family Twist. Today's guest, Peter, takes us on a remarkable journey, one that begins with a simple DNA test and leads to a complete unraveling of identity.
Peter found out at age 59 that he was adopted. A genealogist by hobby, he was researching his family tree when he discovered the roots he'd never known were his.
In this episode, part one of our conversation, Peter shares the emotional and often shocking details of how he pieced together his true story, how he met his biological family, and the moment he realized his entire life had been built on a lie.
You'll hear about a long-lost sister, a birth mother who never wanted to let him go, and a father who was once a barber to prime ministers, and whose name Peter fought to have restored to his rightful place.
This is a story about family, identity, and finding the truth, no matter how long it takes or how much it hurts. Let's jump into part one of our powerful conversation with Peter.
Very good.
Peter, welcome to the Family Twist podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's all my pleasure.
Our pleasure as well. So before we talk about this very important organization, can you kind of take us back a little bit and talk about your DNA discovery?
I was a family genealogist. I got interested in genealogy because my mother-in-law was fostered out as a child after her mother had passed away. And she was interested in her family history. She knew basically nothing about it and didn't even know her really a family name or a mother's family name. And I worked that out in about a week, and I thought I'm pretty good at this. I should do my own. That led to 13,500 people in my family tree. I went to a number of interstate family tree reunions, and that culminated in me having a headstone remanufactured for the Irish convict ancestor and refurbishing his grave and organising my own reunion around that. So DNA was just a natural progression of that, but the real trigger for that was my oldest grandchildren had dark olive skin, which I assumed all came from their father, but I was interested in investigating that further. And Ancestry ad come on TV one night, and my wife said, just buy 3 kits, one for you and me and one for our oldest granddaughter, and that's what I did. So I wasn't looking for anything, and I didn't understand DNA. I understood how to build a tree, obviously, and I didn't understand centimorgans, which is a basic measure for DNA. And when my granddaughter, it was a match, that wasn't a surprise, and there was a match from a woman, and she messaged me and said, I grew up in an Italian family. When I was 11-year-old, when my father died, my siblings teased me and told me I was adopted. So I was empathetic, and I wanted to try and help her, and I thought she fitted in my family somewhere. So I spent about 6 months trying to work it out by trees. Does she fit on this side of the family? Does she fit on that side? Is an uncle here, a cousin there? I brought my parents a DNA kit for Christmas in 2016. Didn't do it until about February 2017 before they actually did the test, and early March I'm looking in the tree and the DNA just in case it came in a bit early, and all of a sudden something didn't seem right. I realised that there was no surnames in my DNA matches, and I checked my wife's DNA matches, and sure enough there was surnames there that I was familiar with. And I always knew where I was born. I was born at the Salvation Army Bethesda Hospital in Marrickville, a suburb of Sydney. And I'd Googled that many years before and got an image of an old building. I now Googled it again in desperation, and all this information came up about forced adoption, government apology, none of which I was aware of. And there was more than a smoking gun. It was obvious that, it was me that was adopted, and this woman who didn't fit in my tree, I fit in hers, and she was in fact my sister.
Wow.
I look back at that now and I feel embarrassed it took me 6 months to work that out, but I just wasn't looking, So
Yeah.
I was in the wrong place for the wrong thing.
Goodness. So, what did she tell you initially about your father, your birth father?
She was 11-year-old. She didn't know a lot about him. She knew that he was a hairdresser. He owned a business initially in Canberra, our nation's capital. He was a hairdresser to the politicians. In fact, the Prime Minister of the day and the opposition leader of the day were part of his clientele. He'd moved from Canberra to Sydney and ran hairdressing businesses there successfully for many years. He got cancer. He had cancer for about 5 years before he died, but he travelled to England looking for operations or cures. And when that became evident, that he returned to Italy. He wanted to die in Italy, in the village that he grew up in southern Italy. So that's where he remains today.
Wow.
All my friends said when they found that out was, well, of course he came from Calabria.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, you being an amateur genealogist, what kind of thoughts are going through your head when you have this discovery and all of a sudden there's a sister?
It was a roller coaster of emotions. 1 minute, I'm excited that I now have all these siblings. Or it's like a genealogist's dream in one way that we're discovering things, and then the reality hit. Well, who am I? I've been lied to for 59 years. It's how old I was when I found out. Yeah, so you come crashing back down, and you discover something new, and you back up again, and then you realise how much you lost, and you crash back down again, and it's just repeat scenario, up and then back down. And the people that you think that you could trust the most in life are the ones who have actually been lying to you the whole time.
Can I ask whether you were able to speak with your parents about it?
Yeah, I adopted sister, I guess, sister I grew up with, who was my biological child of my adopters. She didn't know, and she's a world-renowned professor of medicine. We're opposites, of course. And she didn't believe the ancestry DNA. She said, I've got friends of mine who are, geneticists, professors of genetics, and I'm sure they can do a DNA test between you and me. And anyway, she had all this happening in the background, but I was sure. And I did two things. I quickly learned a little bit more about DNA, and I was looking for an ancestral surname in my DNA matches, and I found two extensive trees around the 7th or 8th cousin, so quite a long way from me. But I figured they had a common ancestor. That common ancestor will also be my ancestor, and I would find an ancestral surname. And I did that, and I picked an ancestral surname, and I copied one of their trees, and I put the focal point in on that ancestor, and I built the tree down so that encompassed more and more marriages, which produced more and more surnames, which I found was also in my DNA matches, which to me proved that I was in the right tree. And then if I could find my mother, she belonged in that tree somewhere. So at the same time, I applied for my adoption certificate, which in Australia we're entitled to, and I know most of the states in America still aren't entitled to it. Those records are sealed. In Australia, they're not sealed, and there's been openness of that since the early 1990s. And again, after we had an apology, the records were opened, every state basically. So I applied for that. There's another long story there, but we won't go into that. And in about it took me about 6 weeks from the time I found out the adoption certificate. And when I got that, I had my mother's name. And I rang up my sister as soon as I opened and found that, and I said, hold everything. I have the adoption certificate. It has their names on it, the signatures. And she said, Yeah, well, there's one more thing we have to do. I said, what's that? She said, we need to tell them that you know. And she said, do you want to do it or do you want me to do it? And without even thinking, I went, no, you can do it. And I think that was absolutely the right thing to do. And this was, I think, the Thursday night before Mother's Day in 2017. So her and her husband went and saw them on the day before Mother's Day and told them that I knew. They also arranged to take them out of Mother's Day to lunch, and they arranged with me to arrive just before they did. So
Wow.
I
Happy
arrived
Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day, exactly. I'm walking on eggshells. I arrive with a bunch of flowers. I'm greeted at the door by the adopted father, who then goes on to say, you saved our marriage. Those are the first words as I walk through the door.
Oh,
And then said, we burnt the papers when you're a teen because you're always ours. So I took a breath then, and anyway, I proceeded to explain how I'd just made the discovery. And while I was doing that, my sister and her husband arrived, and I got to the point where I said that I had found my mother and my siblings, and I was going to reunite with them in 3 weeks' time, in Queensland. Another state had applied to Queensland. To which my adopted mother said, I want to go.
Oh,
I didn't want her to go. And I'm still walking on eggshells, and my sister, who's quite forward, said, no, this is Peter's journey. He needs to do it alone. To which my adopted mother said, but you said she had a stroke. What if she dies and I don't get to meet her? And I'm thinking, hang on a minute. You're taking this to your grave. You didn't care whether I met her or not. And I realised at that point this was not about me. It was about them and their marriage. My sister again read the room and went, yep, now it's time we went to lunch. And we parted ways. So, yeah, I did confront him in a way. I went there thinking I was going to have lots of questions, but in the end I didn't. I just got the answers, and I didn't need any questions. They were old and frail, so, if it had happened 10 years earlier, we might have had a confrontation and maybe sorted it out and maybe rebuilt some things, but that was the way it was going to be. So.
So now that you have some of the answers, where do you go from there?
Well, as I said, when I got that name of my mother, and I already had the ancestral surname, I just Googled my mother's name and the surname. And within seconds, I found my brother. The surname was Trindle. And he was on a Trindle Tree blog site. And he named my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandfather. And I looked for my grandfather's name in my tree, and I found his name, but I wasn't sure I had the right person, but I took a punt, and I added my grandmother's name under his and my mother's name under hers, and then I got hints in Ancestry of other people who had those names in their tree, and I discovered that my brother also had an ancestry tree, and he was also a genealogist and had an extensive tree. And when I looked at his tree, I saw 2 brothers under a first marriage, a brother and 2 sisters under a second marriage. And when I looked close, I realised there was a fatherless child in between. And my wife was there at the same time, looking and went, that's you. I went, yeah, of course it's me. And she said, you need to message him. I said, I know. I messaged him through the Ancestry messaging service. That was 8 o'clock at night, and 5 a.m. in the morning I saw that he had seen the message, and just after 5 p.m. that afternoon I was speaking with him, and after an hour and a half conversation with him, he gave me my mother's number and she was waiting for my call. And what came out of that conversation, that he knew exactly who I was when I messaged, and he'd known that I existed for exactly 3 weeks. My mother had confided in her oldest son and her husband of 55 years just 3 weeks before I made my discovery.
Wow.
That is wow.
Or 3 weeks before I found them, yeah.
Wow.
So I guess I was already in the process. And the stars aligned, or, she knew it was the right time. I don't know. Yeah,
It is amazing to me how, because of the platform that Ancestry is, people just can discover the same things at the same time, and not know each other. I love that.
Yeah.
It's just serendipitous. But anyway, it's great.
Yeah. So I went to Queensland and I met my mum. I spoke to mum on the phone first, and her first words, I only remember a couple of things out of that conversation. Her first words were, "I was forced. I never wanted to give you up." It was the exact first words out of her mouth. And whilst I was talking to her, my wife kept saying, "Ask who your father is." And I had a fair idea who my father was, but I needed for her to confirm that without me prompting her with a name. And I'm waiting for the right time, because there is no right time. My wife prodded me. So I said, "Who's my father?" And she told me it was the name of the father that I believed it was. And her words were, "He was a lovely man." And I've heard that on both sides of the family. I've heard that on his side of the family. He was still revered in his family. And I've heard those same words over and over again. So, yeah, that's comforting to know. So, yeah, I went to a reunion in Queensland and met up with my brothers and sisters and family, and we all looked similar. There's a similarity between the lot of us. Yeah, that was a big day.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're a fan of roller coasters, but we talk about roller coasters a lot on the podcast because there are so many ups and downs. Kendall and I were recording an episode of just T and I this past weekend, and it certainly went in a different direction because I said something that opened that wound that was still raw. And so, we know that's something that can happen in an instant, and there's your down, there's going down the hill,
Whenever I watch another reunion or hear a podcast, that's when it hits me every single time. And it's involuntary. It just chokes me up.
I'm so fortunate on so many levels, but because of my lack of a relationship with my mother, my birth mother, I'm always kind of easily triggered by people's stories, and it's no one's fault. It's just the way it is.
I don't avoid those, by the way.
Yeah.
Obviously, you don't avoid them either. So,
No.
it's part of the course. And
Yeah.
Well, what's commendable is that you didn't stop there. You got involved with this amazing organization. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a sheer accident. I was invited to the 5th anniversary of the National Apology, which the National Apology happened on the 21st of March, 2013. So, 5 years before I found out about it. I didn't know I'd been apologised to. So I was invited to this 5th anniversary luncheon, which was being held at the New South Wales Parliament House. I'd never been to New South Wales Parliament House before, so yeah, there was a bit of a buzz. And I'd written a poem, actually, called "Adoption is Such a Lie." And this is 2018. I was nearly a year after. I was coming home from work, and I don't know what happened, what made me think of it. I just thought, I've got to write a poem. Now, I couldn't put two rhyming sentences together at school. But for some reason, I thought, I've got to write a poem that's got to be rhyming, and I've got to do it when I get home. And I wrote 8 pages of rhyming poem.
What?
So I'm keen to show someone this. So I took it with me. And they had a guest speaker, and who was an adoptee. This woman, when she came off the stage, lots of mothers crowded around her, and I waited my turn. And in fact, she said, "Why didn't you push in?" They were all pushing in. She just, no, I went, no, it's fine. And I handed her the poem, and she promptly put it in her handbag. I went, oh, okay. But a few days later, she contacted me and she said, I want you to join my Facebook page. So I did. And I must have posted something, and another member of that Facebook page approached me and messaged me and said, we're starting a committee. I want you on it. I want you to join another Facebook page. So I just did what I was told. I knew nothing about what was going on. I just joined this other Facebook page, and that was the beginning of Adoptee Rights Australia, which they'd been formulating for quite some time, and it was culminating in this meeting. I became the public officer, and I incorporated with that name. The woman who had invited me to the original Facebook page, she was the first president of Adoptee Rights, Dr. Catherine Lynch. And then I became the second president about 12 months later. I've been in that role ever since. Right. Yeah, so yeah, it was, yes, but sheer fate or accident. Some of the members have said to me that I hit the ground running, and I didn't get much choice. I was pushed off the train, run or fall on your face, you know.
Well, it's amazing how, like, you didn't know you were adopted, and yet you just landed right in the right spot. I mean, I've always known that I was, but I think because I had never made a discovery, I didn't have the yearning that I have now to connect with others who have also had discoveries.
That's the end of part 1 of our conversation with Peter, and if you're like us, you're still taking it all in.
Peter's story is full of heartbreak, grace, and strength. From accidentally discovering he was adopted to reuniting with siblings and a mother who'd carried a 59-year-old secret.
And just when you thought it can't get more intense, wait until part 2. We'll hear how Peter fought a 6-year legal battle to get his father's name added to his birth certificate, and how he became a powerful advocate for adoptee rights in Australia.
If today's episode moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. These stories aren't just personal, they're universal.
We'll be back next week with part 2. Until then, remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. The Family Twist podcast is presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications and produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.